Picture an island so completely cut off from the rest of the world that the people living on it had no contact with any other human beings for roughly 12,000 years. Not a generation, not a century, 12,000 years. While Egypt built pyramids, and Greece built philosophy, and Europe built Stonehenge, the people on this island were building something else entirely. Something that had already been accumulating for tens of thousands of years before any of those civilizations drew their first breath. And most of it is still down there, sealed under the oldest temperate wilderness on earth, waiting. The island that time forgot. Tasmania sits 80 kilometres south of mainland Australia, across a stretch of water called Bass Strait. Today that crossing takes about 30 minutes by plane or 10 hours by ferry, if you have packed enough snacks and a reasonable attitude toward ocean swells. It does not feel like a particularly dramatic separation when you are looking at it on a map. But that gap between island and mainland is one of the most consequential pieces of water in the entire human story. And understanding why requires going back to a moment when it did not exist at all. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, global sea levels were somewhere between 100 and 120 meters lower than they are today. The land that now sits under Bass Strait was dry. It was a broad, flat, cold plain connecting what is now Tasmania directly to the Australian mainland. Archaeologists call it the Bassian Plain. People walked across it. Animals moved across it. For tens of thousands of years, the island that would become Tasmania was simply the southwestern corner of a much larger continent. Those people who walked south across that plain did not know they were entering what would eventually become the most geographically isolated human community on the planet. Nobody handed them a brochure. They followed animals, followed water, followed the logic of survival through an Ice Age landscape that looks almost nothing like the green island tourists photograph today. The southwest corner of Tasmania, even then, was extreme country. The climate during glacial periods was dramatically colder and drier than it is now. Wind came off the Southern Ocean with nothing to stop it. Vegetation was sparse and tough. The landscape was largely open grassland and subalpine scrub, rather than the dense buttongrass moorland and ancient temperate rainforest that covers the same ground today. And people were living in it anyway. That fact alone should stop you for a moment, because the southwest of Tasmania is not gentle country even now, with modern equipment, Gore-Tex waterproofs, and a GPS signal. In the middle of an ice age, with stone tools and accumulated knowledge and absolutely nothing else, people were not just surviving there. They were, as the evidence eventually made clear, thriving. What they actually found. The southwest of Tasmania is karst country. Underneath the moorland and the ancient forest, the bedrock is heavily folded limestone, riddled with caves and sinkholes and underground passages that have been forming and collapsing and reforming for millions of years. That geology, as it turned out, was doing humanity an enormous archival favour. In 1973, archaeologist Rhys Jones began working at a cave called Kutikina in the Franklin River Valley in southwest Tasmania. What his team found inside that cave rearranged the timeline that Australian archaeology had been working from. The cave contained hearths, tens of thousands of animal bones, predominantly those of Bennett's wallaby and wombat, stone tools manufactured from locally sourced silicious dolerite, and occupation deposits that pushed human presence in this extreme southwestern corner of the continent back further than almost anyone had been prepared to argue. Kutikina was occupied during the last glacial maximum. The radiocarbon dates coming back from the cave put human activity there at somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. People were sheltering in these limestone caves, hunting across the subalpine plain outside, manufacturing tools with considerable technical sophistication, and conducting what the evidence strongly implies were organized, repeated, deliberate occupations of a landscape that was, by any modern standard, punishingly difficult to survive in. Then came Warreen Cave in the Maxwell River Valley, and the dates pushed back further still. Occupation at Warreen has been dated to approximately 35,000 years before the present. 35,000 years. For a sense of scale, Stonehenge was begun roughly 5,000 years ago. The oldest phase of the pyramids at Giza dates to around 4,500 years ago. The people sheltering in Warreen Cave were already doing so 7 times longer ago than either of those things existed, and it does not stop there. Bone Cave, also in the southwest, produced occupation evidence dating back to somewhere in the range of 30,000 years ago. Stone artifacts, faunal remains, evidence of fire. Now here is the thing that the mainstream account of Tasmanian history almost never leads with. Alongside the tools and the bones and the hearths, researchers found ochre, red and yellow ochre, processed and used deliberately in quantities that go well beyond any practical function. You do not carry ochre into a cave during an ice age because it helps you hunt wallaby. You carry it because it means something, because you are doing something with it that belongs to a category of human activity that we tend to describe carefully as cultural or ceremonial or symbolic. Ochre in an Ice Age cave in the southwest of Tasmania is not a casual find. It is evidence of a fully realized human culture operating with intention and meaning in one of the most extreme environments on Earth, at a time when most of the planet's human population was confined to warmer, more forgiving latitudes. The caves of southwest Tasmania are, in the most literal scientific sense, older than almost everything most people would describe as ancient, and the researchers who study them are still working out the full implications of what that means. The Ice Age didn't stop them. This is probably the point where it is worth pausing to actually think about what surviving in glacial southwest Tasmania required, not in the abstract, specifically. Temperatures during the last glacial maximum were roughly 6 to 8 degrees Celsius colder than today on average. In southwestern Tasmania, which already sits in one of the most consistently wind-battered corners of the southern hemisphere, that meant conditions closer to what you would now find in southern Patagonia or coastal Iceland. Treeless, windswept, periodically glaciated at higher elevations. The growing season for anything edible was short and unreliable. The people living in Kutikina and Warreen and Bone Cave were not stumbling through this landscape in a state of constant, desperate survival. The evidence does not support that picture. What the faunal assemblages from these caves actually show is systematic, organized, highly efficient hunting. The wallaby bones recovered from Kutikina alone number in the hundreds of thousands. That is not the waste record of people barely getting by. That is the record of people who understood their prey, understood their landscape, and were operating with the accumulated ecological knowledge of many generations, applied to a specific, demanding environment. The stone tool assemblages are equally telling. The tools recovered from southwest Tasmanian cave sites show consistent manufacture techniques and consistent raw material selection across extended time periods, meaning people were returning to the same sources for the same stones and making the same kinds of tools in the same ways across thousands of years. That kind of consistency does not happen by accident. It happens because knowledge is being deliberately transmitted from one generation to the next, tested, refined, and passed on again. There is a specific type of backed artifact found across these southwest Tasmanian sites. Small, retouched flakes designed to be hafted into composite tools that represents a level of technical sophistication entirely inconsistent with the old, frankly embarrassing narrative that Tasmanian Aboriginal people were somehow more primitive or less developed than mainland Aboriginal groups. That narrative was wrong when it was first proposed, and the archaeological record has been systematically dismantling it ever since. These were not people clinging to the edge of survival by their fingernails. These were people who had mastered one of the most demanding environments on the planet, and were doing so with a level of cultural and technological sophistication that deserves to be described plainly for what it is: extraordinary. The stone arrangements nobody talks about. Here is where the story gets a little less tidy, and honestly, less tidy is usually where things start getting interesting. The cave sites of southwest Tasmania receive most of the archaeological attention, and understandably so, because caves preserve material in ways that open landscapes simply cannot. But there is a broader category of evidence across Tasmania that remains significantly understudied, not because researchers doubt its significance, but because the sheer scale and difficulty of the terrain makes systematic survey genuinely hard. Tasmania contains documented stone arrangements, not in the numbers that have been recorded in some parts of mainland Australia, and the southwest in particular presents extraordinary logistical challenges to anyone attempting ground survey, but they exist. Cleared and modified areas, stone features whose placement and orientation resist any obvious, purely functional explanation. Now, the comparison to Stonehenge in the title of this video is not an accident, but it does require a moment of honesty. Nobody is claiming there is a ring of standing stones hidden in the Tasmanian rainforest, waiting to be helicopter lifted into a documentary. That would be an excellent documentary, but it is not what the evidence supports. What the comparison is actually pointing at is something more fundamental and arguably more important than the stones themselves. Stonehenge is significant not because of what it looks like. It is significant because of what it represents. It represents a society with sufficient organization, knowledge, and cultural continuity to conceive, plan, and execute a major landscape modification project across multiple generations. It represents accumulated astronomical knowledge. It represents a community capable of transmitting purpose and meaning across long stretches of time. By every measure that actually matters, the people who occupied the limestone caves of southwest Tasmania during the last glacial maximum were doing all of those things, transmitting knowledge across generations, operating with sophisticated cultural frameworks, modifying and reading their landscape with deliberate intent. And they were doing it roughly 20,000 years before anyone put the first stone at Salisbury Plain. There is specific evidence from other parts of Tasmania that strengthens this picture. In the Midlands and in parts of the northwest, stone arrangements have been recorded by researchers, including those working with the Aboriginal Heritage Office. The Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre has documented cultural landscape features across the island that represent a depth of purposeful human interaction with country going back far further than the public conversation about Tasmanian prehistory has generally acknowledged. The difficulty is not absence of evidence, it is access. Much of southwest Tasmania is accessible only on foot, across terrain that takes experienced bushwalkers multiple days to cross in good conditions. Systematic archaeological survey of that landscape has barely begun relative to what is almost certainly still out there, which means the honest scientific position right now is not that nothing significant exists in those unexplored areas, it is that we have not yet looked properly. The severing. Somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended. Global temperatures rose. Ice sheets that had locked up enormous quantities of the world's water began to melt. Sea levels rose, and the broad, flat, cold plain of the Bassian Plain, which had connected Tasmania to the Australian mainland for tens of thousands of years, slowly disappeared under the rising waters of what became Bass Strait. It did not happen overnight. The flooding of a land bridge of that scale is a process measured in centuries. The communities living on either side of the narrowing connection would have watched the coastline shift within living memory, then within generational memory, and then eventually found themselves separated by a stretch of open water that their watercraft technology at that point in time was not suited to crossing reliably. The result was the most complete geographic isolation of a human population anywhere on Earth in the post-glacial period. The Palawa people, the Aboriginal Tasmanians, became an island community of somewhere between 3,000 and 15,000 people, depending on which population estimate you find most credible, with no contact with the outside world. Not occasional contact, not trade, not seasonal crossings, nothing, for approximately 12,000 years. Let that number do its work for a moment. 12,000 years ago, farming had not yet been invented anywhere on Earth. Writing would not exist for another 7,000 years. The city of Jericho, one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements ever found, was just getting started. The entirety of recorded human civilization, everything from ancient Mesopotamia to the modern smartphone in your pocket, fits inside the window of time during which the Palawa people were living on this island with no contact from the world beyond Bass Strait. That is not a story about isolation in the sense of deprivation or stagnation. That is a story about a culture that contained within itself, entirely self-sufficiently, everything a human community needs to sustain itself, develop, and transmit meaning across an unimaginable span of time. What was sealed inside Tasmania when the land bridge went under was not a museum exhibit. It was a living, continuously evolving human culture with a depth of accumulated knowledge that the outside world simply had no access to, and for most of the period that followed, no awareness of at all. The knowledge that survived anyway. The Palawa people who were living on Tasmania when European ships first appeared in their waters in the 17th century were not the remnant of a culture frozen in the Ice Age. They were the inheritors of a tradition of accumulated knowledge so deep and so continuously refined that modern researchers are only beginning to understand its actual scope. Fire management across the Tasmanian landscape was not random or reactive. It was deliberate, sophisticated, and ecologically precise. The open mosaic of grassland and heath and forest that early European explorers described across large parts of Tasmania was not natural in the sense of untouched. It was the product of thousands of years of carefully managed burning, applied with detailed knowledge of species response, seasonal timing, and landscape hydrology that no outside observer arriving by ship could have recognized for what it actually was. The Palawa maintained distinct dialects across different parts of the island, with researchers identifying somewhere in the range of 6 to 8 distinct language varieties among a population of a few thousand people. That linguistic diversity, maintained across 12,000 years of isolation, is itself evidence of a sophisticated social organization that kept regional communities distinct while also maintaining the broader networks that allowed the island population to function as a coherent whole. Seasonal movement patterns were highly organized. Communities moved between coastal and inland resources, following a detailed annual calendar of availability that encoded in practice a comprehensive understanding of the island's ecology across its full range of environments, from the surf beaches of the west coast to the dolerite peaks of the central plateau to the estuaries of the east. And then, in the space of roughly 70 years following sustained European settlement from 1803 onward, almost all of it was nearly destroyed. The Black War, the period of frontier conflict between British colonists and Palawa people from approximately 1824 to 1831, and the forced removal of the surviving Palawa population to Flinders Island that followed, reduced a population that had sustained itself continuously for 50,000 years to a handful of survivors within a single human lifetime. Truganini, widely and incorrectly described for most of the 20th century as the last Tasmanian Aboriginal person, died in 1876. The framing of her death as the end of a people was wrong when it was first applied, and it has been deliberately and successfully challenged by the Tasmanian Aboriginal community ever since. The Palawa people were not extinguished, but the violence done to their culture, their language, and their continuity of knowledge in that period represents one of the most rapid and devastating cultural destructions in the documented human record. What survived did so because of the people who refused to let it go, and the reclamation of that knowledge from Palawakani language revival to the reassertion of cultural land management practices, is one of the most significant ongoing stories in Australian history. It just rarely gets treated that way. What is still sealed beneath? Here is what the researchers who actually work in this field will tell you, usually with the careful qualifications that serious scientists use when the honest answer is, "We strongly suspect, but cannot yet confirm." The cave sites excavated in southwest Tasmania, Kutikina, Warreen, Bone Cave, and the handful of others that have been formally studied, represent a tiny fraction of the karst landscape that exists in the southwest. The Franklin River Valley alone contains cave systems that have not been fully mapped, let alone archaeologically surveyed. The limestone geology of the Arthur Range and the ranges further south contains cave systems that, in some cases, have never been entered by a researcher at all. The conditions inside these caves, cold, dark, stable in temperature and humidity, are almost ideal for the preservation of organic material. Bone survives. Charcoal survives. Ochre survives. In the right conditions, even plant material survives. The deposits in Kutikina and Warreen have demonstrated that occupation material can be preserved in these environments for 30,000 years and more in readable condition. Which means the unsurveyed cave systems of southwest Tasmania almost certainly contain archaeological deposits of comparable or greater age and significance. That is not speculation offered for dramatic effect. That is a straightforward implication of what the surveyed sites have already produced, applied to the much larger area of similar geology that remains unsurveyed. In 2013, a research team led by Dr. Gillian Garvey returned to cave sites in the southwest and produced refined analysis of the faunal assemblages from earlier excavations, finding evidence of prey selection patterns that suggested organized cooperative hunting strategies operating across extended time periods. That kind of finding does not come from a generalized poke around with a trowel. It comes from detailed, systematic analysis of material that has been sitting in the ground, perfectly preserved, for 15,000 to 20,000 years, waiting for someone to ask the right question. There is also a category of evidence that the caves cannot contain: the open landscape features, the stone arrangements, the modified trees, the scarred and shaped and deliberately worked trees that serve as markers, boundaries, and records in Aboriginal landscape traditions across the continent. Southwest Tasmania's tree species include some of the longest-lived organisms in the world. Huon pine specimens in the region have been dated to over 2,000 years in age. The broader ecological record encoded in that ancient forest is a form of archive in its own right, and one that is only beginning to be read by researchers working in partnership with Palawa knowledge holders. The honest answer to the question of what is still sealed beneath southwest Tasmania is more than we currently know, probably significantly more. And the rate at which new findings are reshaping the existing picture suggests that the next decade of research in this region is going to be genuinely revelatory. Why Tasmania changes the story. There is a version of Australian prehistory that gets told in schools and museums and documentary series that runs roughly as follows. Humans arrived in Australia somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago. They spread across the continent. They developed rich and diverse cultures. And then European colonization disrupted all of that. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that Tasmania specifically exposes. The Tasmanian evidence adds a dimension to the human story that the mainland record, for all its richness, cannot provide in quite the same way. It adds isolation, complete, documented, multi-millennial isolation of a human community that arrived with the full cognitive and cultural toolkit of modern Homo sapiens, and then developed entirely independently of every other human population on Earth for 12,000 years. That is a natural experiment of extraordinary scientific value, and it is one that researchers across archaeology, genetics, linguistics, and cognitive science are only beginning to fully exploit. The genetic evidence from ancient and modern Palawa populations has already contributed to refining the broader understanding of the initial human dispersal into Sahul, the combined landmass of Australia and New Guinea during the glacial period. The linguistic evidence, fragmentary as it is due to the devastation of the colonial period, offers tantalizing hints about the deep structure of language development in complete isolation. The archaeological evidence from the cave sites resets the baseline for what human cultural complexity looks like in extreme environments at the height of the last ice age. And perhaps most importantly, the Tasmanian evidence is a reminder that the conventional markers of complexity that archaeology has historically used, monumental architecture, written records, agricultural systems, are not actually measures of cultural sophistication. They are measures of particular kinds of cultural expression that developed in particular environmental contexts. A community that sustained itself, its knowledge, its ceremony, its language, and its ecological relationship with one of the most demanding landscapes on Earth, across 50,000 years of continuous occupation, is not a simple society. It is one of the most enduringly successful human cultures the planet has ever produced. The fact that it left its record in ochre and bone and carefully managed landscapes rather than in stone temples and written texts does not make it less significant. It makes it harder to see. And things that are hard to see have a way of being underestimated right up until the moment someone finally looks properly. Tasmania is that moment, or the beginning of it anyway. Half an hour south of Hobart, the road runs out, past the end of the sealed surface, past the last farmhouse, past the last mobile phone signal. The southwest wilderness begins. It covers an area roughly the size of Switzerland. There are no roads through most of it. Access is by foot, by boat, or by small plane landing on a gravel airstrip at Melaleuca, which has a population of 1 person and the distinction of being the most remote, permanently occupied location in Australia. 1 person, which, if you have spent any time in that landscape, makes complete and obvious sense. Inside that wilderness, under the button grass and the ancient rainforest and the cold limestone karst, the record is still down there. Ochre and bone and charcoal and stone, sealed in caves that have not been mapped, in deposits that have not been touched, holding information about human life in extreme cold, in complete isolation, across a span of time that makes most of what we call history look like a recent footnote. Stonehenge is 5,000 years old, and the world treats it as one of the great monuments to human achievement. The people who sheltered in Kutikina Cave were already doing something just as purposeful, just as culturally rich, just as deliberate, 7 times longer ago than that. The question the science cannot yet answer is not whether something significant is still sealed beneath southwest Tasmania. The evidence already makes clear that it almost certainly is. The question is what it will change about the way we understand ourselves as a species when it finally comes to light. Tasmania is not a footnote to the Australian story. It is not a small island at the bottom of the map to be crossed on the ferry with enough snacks and a good attitude. It is one of the most important archives of human experience anywhere on Earth, and it has barely been opened. If this is the first time you have genuinely thought about what is sitting under that wilderness, leave it in the comments. Subscribe for more ancient Australian history that the standard account keeps leaving out.